Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Policy Commons by Indian School of Public Policy. It's a dialogue series where we bring together samaj, sarkar, and bazaar on the same platform to discuss public policy issues. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all our panelists for joining us today on the discussion on the development of land markets and assets in India. Today we have with us Mr. Ambrish Mehta, trustee and activist of Action Research in Community Health and Development, also known as ARCH Rohini in Gujarat. He has been working on the issues of tribal and forest development for the past 4 decades. We have with us Dr. KP Krishnan, an honorary research professor at the Center of Policy Research. Before this, he was IEPF chair professor at the National Council for Applied Economic Research. He has served in various positions in the Government of India and the Government of Karnataka and World Bank in the areas of economic affairs and macro policy and rural and urban development. We also have with us Mr. Anuj Jain, partner in deal advisory team of KPMG and leads the insolvency practice in India. He has over 22 years of work experience in various facets of deal advisory, assisting a cross-section of multinational corporate and private equity clients in evaluating risks and opportunities of their investment plans. I would like to thank Dr. Nimai Mehta for joining us and also moderating the session. He is senior professorial lecturer at American University, Washington, D.C. He has most recently led the university's research engagements in Myanmar and India in the fields of education and public health. Dr. Mehta has been heading a project team at the Center for Civil Society that is working on a comprehensive assessment of agriculture land laws across the Indian states. Audience member, it's an interactive session. You can ask your questions at the end of the session, which is 15 minutes. You can also post your questions in the question and answer section or in the chat box, and we'll take those in the question answer round. I request everybody to stay on the mute mode when the session is on. Over to you, Dr. Mehta.
Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you for the introduction. So let me spend a few minutes just making some opening remarks about and giving the audience some sense of what the panel would like to cover. And then we'll have each panel member, the 3 panel members, take about 5 minutes each to present, highlight what they think are the most important aspects of land markets and reform, the needed reforms in India. And then I'll go back and request each member to address some specific questions that we've put together. And that'll take us about 15 minutes before the end of the session. And we like to then at the end open it up for the rest of the audience to ask their questions directly to the panel. So land, as we know, is a highly emotive issue. And land reform, needless to say, has proved to be a hot potato for every Indian government. Any mention of easing our maze of land laws in India seems to immediately raise suspicions of cronyism and of being pro-rich, which unfortunately in some cases has been justified given the history of the exercise of eminent domain by the state under various land acquisition acts. Nevertheless, the need for fundamental reform, overhaul of our land laws and markets remains urgent. Land remains the dominant asset for the vast majority of Indian households and businesses in both rural and urban areas, for the poor, the middle class, for small and large businesses, for those operating in the formal and in the informal sectors. Dr. Krishnan, I was struck by the statistics you recently cited in some of your publications from the 2017 National Sample Survey, that the average Indian household keeps more than 65% of its assets in land. That self-employed households, many of whom run small businesses, hold more than 75% of their assets in land. Reserve Bank of India data suggests that 60% of all retail loans are indexed to real estate as collateral in some form or the other. And more than 40% of term loans are collateralized against land and buildings. And for rural India, more than 80% of agricultural loans use land as collateral. And then finally, if we consider that the latest National Sample Survey preview data shows that upwards of 80% of agricultural land in India is held by small marginal farmers, the case for reforming our land laws is not just one of greater efficiency, it clearly remains essential for inclusive growth. The market for land, unfortunately, remains to this day highly fractured, both across and within states and districts. Land, as we know, is a state subject. And as a result, Indian households and businesses have been unable to monetize and employ the full potential value of their assets, value that is needed for securing access to housing, to credit, and other essential economic resources. In the limited time we have today, the panel will attempt to highlight the main fault lines in our land markets and the underlying structural causes and possible routes to reform. I would also request each of you to highlight some important reforms that are already being implemented in the different states, such as Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and more that are in the policy pipeline. And each of you have a valuable perspective that you bring to the issue of land markets and development of these markets and reform. And I'd like to try and piece those, tie those together in a way that the audience will find useful. So I'd like to start by asking Dr. Krishnan to highlight what he considers to be the most important issues in the land market, Indian land market today. Dr. Krishnan.
Thank you, Nidhi, first for the introduction, and Nimai for the background remarks. My greetings to my fellow panelists, Mr. Mehta, Mr. Jain, and good evening to all the assembled audience. Let me first thank ISPP for this opportunity. I'm going to be speaking on an issue that touches everyone personally, and it's an issue in a sense we all know a lot about. And therefore, there isn't a whole lot of new things that one can say on this. All I'll try and do in my first 5 minutes is to sort of place this in a larger context and try and be sort of provocative in the sense that place the well-known facts in a context and bring out some of the contradictions. And in that sense, the story here is no different from what we often find in many other sectors in India. And the basic storyline that I want to highlight is the inappropriate balance in the roles of state and markets in the sector. Paradoxically, despite the quote-unquote large role played by the state capacity in practice is a serious issue. And I'm being euphemistic because when I say state capacity, I don't only mean ability, I also mean issues like integrity. Essentially, the delivery by the state is a serious issue. Technology at one level seems to be making things easier, but adoption of appropriate technologies accompanied by legal and regulatory changes, in my opinion, is the key. As I mentioned, like in other sectors, and Nimai mentioned it in his initial remarks, given that it's a state subject, individual states in many cases are showing the way forward in many of the specific reforms. To very quickly summarize before I get into some factual details, institutional redesign is important for optimal outcomes. And paradoxically, we have suboptimal outcomes both from the state and the markets. And what is of importance to an audience like this, and certainly to researchers like Nimai, is that I think a lot more serious analytical work on land is necessary. Other than the old generation land reform type work in India, which we saw a lot of in the 50s and the 60s and sort of drying up in the 70s, land reforms in the conventional old sort of redistribution, tenancy reform type sense, I don't think we have serious, good quality analytical academic work on land issues today. And I think it's an important requirement. Very quickly, in the balance couple of minutes, agriculture accounts for approximately 46% of India's land resources, but produces under 15% of India's GDP. And I'm just presenting macro pictures. These are facts. These are not necessarily something that one should sort of attach value to, just facts. Industry, and I include services. So secondary and tertiary sector actually approximately use a little over 1%. Urban centers account for about 3%, and they approximately, these contribute close to 2/3 of India's GDP. Now, given the dynamics of development, the question is, can all land for India's urban requirements or industry or services come from non-fertile agricultural lands, as is popularly sought to be made out in popular sort of TV and media? I think the answer is a capital no. If India's entire population was to be housed in urban areas, and if everyone was to work in the secondary and tertiary sector, even then the incremental land requirement for this absolutely seismic shift is about 25 million hectares, or less than 20% of the land presently under agriculture. Even if we do all of this, will we have enough land to grow food for all of India, given current levels of productivity, not even high levels of productivity? The answer in a macro sense is capital yes. But the paradox is the following, and with that I'll conclude, Nimai. This macro picture is to be contrasted with the micro picture, which is per capita, India is one of the most land scarce countries compared to even the most scarce land countries. And by 2050, the population, the land per population ratio in India will decline 4-fold, and we will be among the most land scarce countries, with only Bangladesh, Mauritius, and Netherlands to the left of India, if you were to plot this in a graph. Even China will be much, much better off than us. Now, the problem that I've outlined will actually get aggravated by a growing India. And hence, I think what we need is an institutionalization of processes that are equitable. And I'm glad, Nimai, you made this point at the very beginning. It's not only a growth question, there is an equity question here. Can we be fair to all stakeholders? And I will stop here and basically end with a plea that public policy should not end up doing what geography has not done, namely make India land shackled. I'll conclude here, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnan, for those insightful remarks. Let me move to Anuj Jain to take his 5 minutes to present his insights.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta. First of all, I would like to thank the Indian School for Public Policy for having me over and giving me this opportunity to address this audience. And I welcome my fellow panelists, Ambrish and Dr. Krishnan, and Dr. Mehta for the kind introduction and chairing this panel. Thank you. I'm a professional. I've worked in my entire life in the private space, and I bring the market's perspective on the entire issue. So India is not a small country. We are around 3.3 million square kilometers, the 7th largest country by landmass in the world. But the problem is that our population is also probably amongst the largest or the 2nd largest by whatever standards you look at. And that brings up a lot of pressure on land. So the challenges are increasing population, and hence the land, and as Dr. Krishnan alluded to in his session, the density of our land is where the problem lies. and we are also growing in a developing country. So land market reforms is probably the most significant of all economic reforms in terms of its impact on growth and quality of development. It is the key to growth of all four sectors, namely agriculture, industrial, services, and infrastructure. And unlocking land capital and monetizing it to fund the development needs of our country can be a big growth factor for India. Pre-independence, the farmers did not have any ownership of land they cultivated. Land was concentrated in the hands of few, leasing and land, and there were some archival practices like the zamindari system. Post-independence, we did a fair bit in terms of land reforms, but they're mostly centered around the agriculture land or the rural land reform in terms of abolishing the zamindari system or bringing ceiling on land holdings, consolidation of land. But now, subsequent to that, I think where we missed the bus was the entire policy around or discussion around land for development, land for industrial purposes or urban development. So in the last few decades, there are a couple of mega trends that we've noted. One is the mass exit from rural labor, which is working in agriculture in the rural areas, to urban centers and fast urbanization of our cities, growth of our cities. And second is from the land perspective, large tracts of agriculture land getting repurposed or redeployed towards industrial or other development purposes. So these are the two mega trends that we are seeing in the last few decades, namely last couple of decades. And we need to address our policy needs to take care of these matters. Unfortunately, land markets in India are very opaque and they lack transparency. As mentioned earlier, land is a subject which is controlled by the state governments, and every state government has a very different set of policies. So there is no harmonization of policies around the land, the development policies, and etc. There are certain inherent problems with land because of the peculiar character, and this impedes the natural emergence of a well-functioning market. In India, despite some reform efforts, the land markets continue to be highly distorted and inefficient. And I think some of the areas where we need to reform are around how do you develop agriculture land, how do you prevent hoarding of land, how do you allow repurposing of land, so that the lands which are in industry, which are very inefficiently used, how do you bring that back to the market and make it into more efficient uses? Also, one area historically what we've seen is that in terms of development, rather than doing free market negotiations or pricing of land when users of projects or for developers of projects buy land, people often tend to resort to practices like using the state government in doing acquisition of land through land acquisition laws, which creates an imperfect market in land. And I think this is gravely damaged the balance between the landowner and the land user, and kind of has built a very, very high mistrust amongst the users and the landowners. This is one area I think we need to regulate, and we need to bring market efficiency or market forces operating so that the user ends up paying the fair value to the owner of the land, and we take out the middleman in between. We take out the politics of land and the middleman in between. Lastly, I'll say by concluding that, because land is a state subject and it's very politically charged subject, so that brings a lot of political intervention, a lot of political interference in land markets, and it doesn't allow markets to operate freely. I think with that, I'll end and maybe then pick it up in the next session.
Great. Thank you, Anuj, for that perspective. We turn now to Ambrish Mehta, who brings a very different perspective, and a rich one from the rural areas of India, from our forests. And he's been working with the tribal groups there. And so, Ambrish, we are looking forward to learning from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nimai and everybody for giving me this opportunity. I have to present civil society or samaj perspective on this. So I would be mainly focusing on how this issue of land and land rights in keeping poor people in focus, and especially the poor who are living in tribal areas and remote, who are some of the most poorest of the groups which we know. When we started working in these tribal areas of Gujarat in 1980s, early 80s, and we started with working with the people who were going to lose their lands and houses under the Sardar Sarovar project on the river Narmada. And the first thing we noticed very early was that most of the people simply had no land rights. Although they were cultivating lands, they were there, they had their houses on these lands, but these lands were supposed to be either forest land or government revenue land, and they simply had no titles on these lands. So after submergence, if the policy had not changed, they would have got nothing. They would get no compensation. They would get, and they would just simply lose their livelihood, and they won't get any fair compensation or rehabilitation. That was the situation. So this brought, and later on we have been moving around in so many areas, and most of the areas, poor people, you find you meet most poor people, and their main issue is that they are cultivating lands for many, many years. They are having their houses on these lands for many, many years, and yet they don't have any titles of these lands. And they are treated as illegal encroachers who can be evicted anytime. And that is the main issue which most of the rural areas, and this is true for poor in not only tribal areas, but in many rural areas and also in the urban areas, in slums and everywhere, that you are living for 40 years, 50 years, you have developed this land, you have made them productive, and you are eking out your livelihood from this land, and yet you don't have really a proper title or proper right over that land. That is the main issue which, so any talk or any discussion of land reforms and way to go ahead, and if it has to be an inclusive development, I think the main issue would be that how do we change this situation and bring, if the land reforms are to benefit these people, then we must find out some way to give titles to the people who are cultivating these lands for much more. In tribal areas, it is not only a question of land, it is also a question of forests. People are living in the forest for centuries, and yet they don't have any right over the forest resources of their villages. Everything belongs to state. That is the basic issue. And luckily, from 2006, we have this Forest Rights Act, and from 2008, it has started being implemented. It acknowledges for the first time that the tribals and forest-dwelling tribal and other poor people who have been living in this forest for centuries, they did not have any right. Their rights, property rights, were not recognized when these forests were notified. And to correct this situation, it was decided that they must be given rights over the land and also over the forest resources. So that thing has happened. There are issues of implementation, but this needs to happen not only on forest lands, it needs to happen on other revenue lands, government lands and other. So that is something which I would like to discuss further. We have some good in the area where we are working. We have been able to we have succeeded in ensuring that most of the families have got their titles under the Forest Rights Act, not only individual rights, but community rights over forest resources also. And the moment they get the right, their whole outlook and their whole view changes. They start taking long-term view of the land. They start taking land improvement measures. They spend their hard-earned money, even sometimes thousands of rupees, even 1 lakh up to lakhs rupees. They invest in that land. They develop irrigation. They level it. They improve their productivity. They bring tree cover and all these things. So what thing? And they start working for removing the poverty and working for their own development on their own without waiting for the schemes from government and without market. So if recognizing these rights would not only lead to the development and would bring these people on their own standing, and they can develop and take measures, but they would also help environment. They would improve land, they would improve productivity, and not only for themselves, but also for forests and environment. This is the issue on which I would need to focus. That's it.
Thank you, Ambrish. I think you bring in a valuable perspective from what's unique about your work with the land rights with the tribals in the forest is that in many ways it's establishing these rights de novo, and you've managed to get the main stakeholders together in a transparent way to acknowledge those rights. And that's something that Dr. Krishnan had the problem of moving from a right system that is simply presumptive to a property right system, a titling system that is conclusive, that cannot be questioned constantly, as we see with any experience that we've had with land issues in India. It seems that in many ways that has been achieved in at least in the sort of work you've been doing with under the Forest Rights Act, and it would be useful to see if we can use that model within the urban areas, and that's something that, and what the requirements would be, both the regulatory requirements and also the interests of the private sector. And I would request Anuj Jain to also address this issue of moving towards a system where land records are transparent, are recognized. There's the mutual recognition of these land records and land registries. So that's something that we can hopefully touch in this discussion. But let me get back to Dr. Krishnan and have him talk a little more detail about what I thought were an interesting set of distinctions he made in his 2017 piece in the Economic Political Weekly. Dr. Krishnan, you made this distinction between what you call structural reforms and opportunistic reforms. Could you briefly help the audience understand this distinction? Do you think we need some minimum number of structural reforms to be established in order for the opportunistic reforms to deliver the outcomes we hope they would? And if yes, what do you think are those minimum structural reforms that would be required?
Thank you. Thanks, Nimai. Structural reforms would include a lot of the issues relating to titling, the kind of issues that Ambrish ji brought up. The Forest Rights Act was a serious structural reform. It recognized, though there are implementation issues, as he himself mentioned, that as of a certain date, those in occupation would be recognized effectively as owners. So it's a serious structural reform. And in that sense, there are a whole host of structural reforms that are required, given the fact that India does not have, other than a judicial declaration of title, a system of confirming title. So as of today, I'm sure we know, for instance, in Bangalore or in similar cities, the huge demand for what is called a BDA plot, the Bangalore Development Authority allotted plot. Now, very often people assume this is because it is well located or well developed. Yes, those are important reasons. But I think the more important, the more intuitive reason for keenness on acquiring a BDA plot is when the state intervenes, acquires the land, it extinguishes all previous title, including disputes on the title, and passes on to the allottee an absolutely clean title. Now, even if two people are fighting about the land, if the acquisition is complete, then the two people are actually fighting only about who will get the compensation. The acquisition itself has extinguished all previous disputes, and hence the allottee gets a clean title. So very often when people are wondering, why does a large company like Tata's or Infosys or Wipro come to the government for land acquisition? In a 10,000 crore project, the cost of that land is actually minuscule. Nevertheless, they come to government for acquisition. And very often, if you know the practice, what they do is the government is paying compensation to the land losers, but so is the private company paying additional compensation because they want a smooth completion of the process. But the reason for this example is to give you a flavor of what are the kind of structural reforms that are required on title, on regularization. These are not easy. These are politically, they demand a lot of capital and they don't happen very frequently. Pending that, can we move closer towards this ideal goal by smaller baby steps? Yes. Some of the IT initiatives, for instance, from the same state that I am familiar with, the state cadre that I belong to, Karnataka, the Kaveri project, originally just automating record of rights in terms of computerization and putting in place a system of controls whereby lower level functionaries could not meddle with the entries in the record. Easier access in terms of all of these available literally in the taluk office, that is the tehsil level office, in a computer, and therefore deliverable literally in a few seconds. The national registration related reforms that have been done, where registration can actually be orderly. And if you're familiar with the sub-registrar's offices, these were not offices that a lot of us would have wanted to go to. Things have enormously improved. They have not, fundamentally rewritten the law. The law continues to be the same. There are a whole host of process changes, which I call opportunistic.
Okay, thank you. Anuj, if I could get back to you, and perhaps you could give us some sense about the talking about the uncertainty in terms of the registration and the titles, and the problem that creates in terms of valuation of specific plots of land, valuation, the uncertain valuations, and in many cases inconsistency in the valuation of plots of land in terms of how the lender is valuing the land, how the borrower is valuing the land, and then the state regulatory agencies value the land. Could you give us a sense of how these valuation problems affects real estate and other development projects in Indian cities, and how is the private sector working around this? And what extent do you think this sort of opportunistic low-hanging fruit reforms that Dr. Krishnan just mentioned would help the private sector address these issues without having to wait for these structural reforms?
Thank you, Dr. Nimai. So, if I understand your question correctly, essentially break it up into three parts as to what are the current challenges with the processes and the policies today, and the entire land market, both in terms of valuations, registrations, transactions, so to put it. Second would be that how are the developers of land for either real estate purposes or industrial uses are overcoming those challenges. And third would be really what can be done in the short term or easy fixes which can be done to improve the situation. So I'll start with the first. So in terms of the real challenges, in terms of valuations, pricing, transactions. So first of all, I'll repeat by saying that there is absolutely no transparency in acquisition of land. The land markets are very opaque, and different states have different rules. Even within the state, different regions have different rules, and there are different rules for acquisition of land for different purposes. So if you want to acquire a freehold land, there are different rules. If you want to acquire a land for a public-private partnership, then the market is different, the rules are different, pricing is different. So in effect, in India, the pricing of land is actually in a way governed by or influenced largely by the land use. So depending upon the use, the pricing of the land is determined. So just to give you an example, in city municipal limits, if you were to buy land for a hospital, it will be at a very different rate than you were to buy for a residential project versus land for an industrial purpose. So purpose-driven pricing is there, and that brings its own challenges, brings the inefficiencies, and very difficult to really pin down on what is a real value. Essentially, and there is lack of free market operation. So you don't have a well-functioning or a transparent free market because land transactions don't get reported. The land records are old and archival. It's very difficult to find out what comparable transactions are. The other reference rate which is used in valuations is the circle rate or municipal rate, what we call. But again, very often we've noted that the municipal rate, circle rate doesn't get updated. Sometimes it is extremely low compared to the market price. And in certain situations, and I have examples of that, where actually the circle rate is significantly higher than the price at which transactions are happening in the market. So there is obviously a need for updating or reviewing the reference rates, which is the reference rate used by government, by tax departments, by the stamp duty department, and bring it more closer to the market benchmarks. Then what we've seen is another big challenge is that what we've often seen is that land owning authorities like development authorities, BDA in Bangalore or Noida in NCR region, or DDA in Delhi region, often tend to charge exorbitant rate of interests, and in order to sell more in connivance with the developers, builders, sometimes they also come up with policies where you pay only a fraction of the cost, and you get ownership rights, and you pay it over 10 years or 5 years in installments, and you pay an exorbitant rate of interest. There are twofold challenges with that. One, if cost of credit is expensive, it impacts the viability of the projects, and eventually it gets toll on the project. And because I'm very closely associated with insolvencies, I see that as one of the big reasons in a lot of urban real estate developer insolvencies, where lands were acquired from the authorities, but at exorbitant rate of interests on a deferred compensation payment basis. And the second problem with that is that when you buy land by paying only a fraction of the cost, what happens is you get the title of the land, the developer gets the title of the land, and he's able to create third-party rights on that land without actually fully paying for it. And in future, when he runs out of money, the problem becomes that the land authorities tries to take back the land or has a lien on the land because cost has not been paid. The customer, the consumer, has actually bought it assuming that the land is owned by the developer or free from any encumbrances, and then it becomes a big challenge. And in fact, in one of the large cases of real estate, the largest one in India, which is JP Infratech, where I happen to be the insolvency professional there and working on it for the last 4 years, we've seen that as a very, very big challenge, and because of which even Honorable Supreme Court had to intervene, and actually the insolvency law underwent several changes to accommodate the aspect of home buyers or landowners, because it was a class very different from traditionally what we know as operational creditors or financial creditors. And they actually were forced to make changes to the regulation, because this is a completely different class. Their risk rewards are different, and it needs to be understood. So that was one. Then next is that in many cases, land acquisition is not based on free market. So it's not a willing buyer and a willing seller who comes together, determines negotiates the price and sell it. Sometimes what happens is that land is acquired by the development agency or the state using land acquisition laws, and then selling it to private developers to profit from it. There was a case like that many years back in Noida, where the matter actually went up to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court held that the land acquisition was wrongly used, and then in turn ordered additional compensation. But after many years of fighting and dispute between the landowners and the development authority and the private developer. So that was an example I wanted to cite, because that's a classic problem of using eminent domain rules or state laws to acquire land, and then giving it to private developers to profit from it. Then land is a politically sensitive subject. Wherever land is involved, especially in the urban region, you always see politics behind it. So we had the Nandigram example in West Bengal. We had Bhatta Parcel in UP. We had POSCO steel plant in Odisha, which could not come up because of land acquisition issues. And there are many, many more examples. Just in the paucity of time, I'm giving some examples of that. Then there's another problem, lack of infrastructure. And because again, infrastructure development is controlled by the government, what happens is that sometimes by just building a road or building simple infrastructure, you can actually open up vast tracts of land. But due to vested interest, due to political interest, the land which is developed or which has access infrastructure is priced significantly higher than land which does not have infrastructure. And in terms of pricing, the residential prices in urban India, the prices for industrial land in urban India, because I meet clients from all over the world, they believe that land is relative to the incomes. Land is significantly more expensive in India than in most parts of the world. So that is so I would call it as artificial barriers created to ensure that certain parts of land are extremely valuable, whereas other areas remain less developed. Then another major problem is that we have this new class of intermediaries known as land aggregators. So the landowner, the farmer, really doesn't get enough for his land. The developer, the end consumer developer, ends up paying extremely high value for land. And the real difference is this class of land aggregators who buy from the farmer, hold it, hoard the land, and then sell it to the developer, and in the end make lots of money. And that's where the big challenge is. So by reforming, we need to really ensure that this class is kept in check, and these are mostly again political affiliations and active in the local markets, and this is where the arbitrage is. So I am not saying that the farmer ends up getting good value for money and the developer doesn't pay cheap for his land, and in most cases it is the aggregator who ends up making money. Next is, and I'll move, yeah, sorry, a couple of more points, Dr. Nimai, and I'll just close. Next is, yeah, sorry.
If I can intervene for a second here, since we are running a bit short of time, let me stop you for just a few minutes so we can get Ambrish's view as well. You mentioned the aggregation of the aggregators that bring in the agricultural land, and Ambrish, I wanted to ask you about under the Forest Rights Act, we've got the establishment of these individual forest rights and the community forest rights, but there's also this continuing problem where there are limits to or barriers to tribals being able to sell their land to either non-tribals or non-agriculturalists. To what extent has that posed a limit on the extent to which these the forest rights that you have seen established, to what extent does that limit the ability of these tribal to monetize the value of their land? Could you speak a bit about that? Then Anuj, will come back to you.
Thank you, Nimai. This, in most of the tribal areas, this is one very important law, and basically brought in long time ago, many years ago, that there are some restrictions in every state. There are different laws, but most of the laws restrict purchase of lands from tribals by non-tribals. That is simply prohibited. And if it happens, then the state would intervene, and one would expect that it would give the land back to the original owner. But that does not happen. That land goes to government. It becomes government land. If an illegal transaction has happened by selling by a tribal willing sale, voluntary sale of his land to a non-tribal, then the whole land deal would be cancelled, and then land would go to, it would become Khalsa, so it would become government land. That is one thing. There are many views, and this is a very politically very sensitive issue. Most of the groups working in the tribal areas and most of the tribals would believe that this is something that has protected the lands from being captured by non-tribals. That view is very much there. Historically, it had some role also. I must tell. We have moving in the tribal areas. We have heard stories where a moneylender or a liquor seller over the years would acquire most of the land surrounding that village, and he would acquire. And basically, this land was brought. This law was brought to protect these tribals from such takeovers of land, But over the years, I think nowadays it is in a way restricting, because tribal transactions happen, development is taking place, roads are coming, many things, and many people want to come establish hotels, establish many other things, and they want land. Transactions happen, but because of this law, these transactions happen under the carpet. They would happen by power of attorney and other things, and as a result, most of the tribals won't get the full value of the land which are. This is not something peculiar to forest rights. Forest Rights Act also has this condition that these lands should not be sold. It can be inherited. It would pass through inheritance, but the families cannot sell these lands. There is a worry among, and to a certain extent, a genuine worry amongst most of the people groups working in the tribal areas, that if this right is given, and most of the tribals will lose these lands. But working with the tribals, I don't believe that is really true. Most of the tribals know how to protect their lands and how to preserve their lands. They would not just sell it away to just like that. This would happen only marginally. I personally believe that most of the tribals would continue to cultivate the land because that is the main source of livelihood. They are not interested in selling these lands. So that is there. So that there are another thing which I would like to point out, that because the state wants to protect tribals from exploitation by the non-tribals, these restrictive land laws are there, that no individual can purchase land from tribals and other things. But there is no restriction on governments taking over tribal lands. So, and you see the history of Indian tribal. Most of the tribals have lost their lands through compulsory acquisition, either for dams or for industries and for. So there is no protection there. Overall, there is no protection that state would think twice before acquiring tribal lands or some other things that they first with only voluntarily. So in a way, and in most of the tribal areas, most of the land, 70 to 80% of the land belongs to governments, either in form of forests or minerals and other things. So this has not really protected. This restriction, its historical significance in the sense of protecting the tribals to way in past, maybe it has protected some groups from certain individual transfers, but overall, it has not protected tribals from compulsorily or compulsory acquisition of the land and not losing of the land. These are the few points which I would like to bring forward.
Thank you, Ambrish. Those are valuable insights. I would like to, we've got about 10 minutes left, and what I propose is I'd like to raise this issue back with Anuj, because his point about the opaque nature of transactions in the urban markets and Dr. Krishnan's suggestion of these low-hanging fruit reforms. Anuj, my question, I'm going to ask you this question, but then at the same time, I'll open it up to the audience. So perhaps we'll take maybe one or two questions from the audience, and you can sort of combine your answers both to what I'd like to see answered and what the audience may be interested in at this point. So the question is, if you consider the digitization and the computerization of these land records that Dr. Krishnan has been talking about, to what extent do you think that will that would solve this problem of transparency? Because what I'm getting a sense from you and also thinking of the structural reforms that are still needed, that there may not be sufficient incentives for a open, transparent land record or pricing system, that unless we get those structural reforms, there's going to be a continuing incentive to keep the opacity within these land markets. So that's sort of the, in a way, that's the hanging question I have, that I'd like both you and Dr. Krishnan to address. But let me,
I would also like to say a few things on that.
Yeah.
Land records.
Go ahead. Let me open up the panel to members of the audience, and perhaps we can take one or two questions, and then I'll allow each of you to respond to the audience members, and if we have time, to my question as well. Nidhi, are the audience able to open up their video screens so the panels can also see what their audience is like and get more engagement from them?
Audience member, you can ask questions and also switch on your video so that it's a more interactive session.
That's one of my requests with all my students when I teach these online classes, is to please open their cameras and get out of the black screen.
Dr. Mehta, I think for today's webinar, we don't have an option of video.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine, not a problem. So let's go ahead and request them to perhaps speak up their any questions that they may have for any of the panel members.
Type in the Q&A chat box. I think that's the,
or in the chat box, yeah. And perhaps while we are waiting for these questions to come in, Anuj and Dr. Krishnan, would you like to get back to this question of transparency, and would digitizations help solve for that?
so I think I'll start. I'll give it a shot, Dr. Nimai. So first of all, I am no technology expert, but I personally feel, having seen the land records and having been part of the ecosystem, that I think it is very, very important that land records are digitized, they're properly cataloged, and they're transparently available at the push of a button or on the internet, so that all this opaqueness about title, who owns, disputes on titles, to a large extent go away. Because most of the reasons when we acquire lands or the developer acquire lands, a lot of time is taken up in the due diligence, in the legal due diligence, in terms of the ownership, establishing the chain. And sometimes I have actually seen the ownership chain going back several decades, if not centuries. So I have actually seen land records of previous century as well, because then in cities where development has been there for many years, you need to go back the full chain. So it's important, and I'm no expert on technology, but things like maybe blockchain and distributed ledgers and all could be used or developed to digitize land records. The only challenge is that whatever technology we use, ideally it should be standardized across the country, and every land should be uniquely identified. Like we have the Aadhaar or we have the PAN, there should be a property number which is in a standardized format, and not that every state is a different format and every city within the state also has a different format. So standardization of the process of the record should be done pan-India. Maybe a national initiative should be done. And digitization of records is only one aspect of it. The other aspect to remove the opacity is in terms of controlling how transactions are done, eliminating to the extent possible black money involved in land transaction, and that can be done by bringing fiscal incentives and maybe giving some rate incentives if the transactions are above the circle rate, or if the transactions, anything, income tax depreciation should be maybe allowed on any amount that is paid above the circle rate, so that the buyer is incentivized to pay by check, and then eventually cleaning up our system. And then thirdly, controlling the intermediaries that operate. So if you acquire land and you don't use the land for say 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, then there should be some kind of a check and balance to say that what are you doing with this land? You're not the original owner. You're not the end user. Why is this land held in some capacity? So those kind of things, along with digitization of records. So digitization will help greatly, but not entirely, unless we bring in other processes and checks and balances around the entire transaction aspect of land.
Thank you. There are some questions that have come in. Nidhi, are the panelists able to see the questions? Otherwise, I'll start reading them. Are you all able to see the Q&A that have come in?
Yes, they're visible to us as well.
Okay. So the first two, I think, are touching on agricultural, rural, tribal issues. Ambrish, would you like to pick up those questions?
That this Naxalism issue and tribals don't have any say. That's true by and large. And to a certain extent, issue of Naxalism is also linked to it. But the government's initiative mainly, one must say that recognize forest rights and give them most of the recognize their rights on lands and forests, and many of the issues would disappear. And it is heartening to know that in Maharashtra, in many Naxal affected areas, it was in fact police officers who took keen interest in implementation of Forest Rights Act, so that people get community rights and they get their land rights, and so this influence would be to a certain extent minimized. So those things are happening, but that is the key issue. That is what this thing is. The main recognize rights of the people living in tribal areas, forest areas, on land, forest, and also other resources. Recognize these rights, and there won't be any conflict, and people would be able to develop their own resources. They would in fact protect forests also. That is what we have found out.
That's very encouraging. Dr. Krishnan, would you take this question on the unique land parcel identification number question? And perhaps and Anuj can take the last one there.
So the unique land parcel identification number has to be an initiative of both the center and the states. It is clearly, land and land revenue is a state subject. It's list 2 in the 7th schedule. The way to sort of assume the intention behind the FM's announcement is likely to be, there can be incentivization by the union, by the center, of doing this, for which the center will underwrite a cost of, a part of the expense of the program, and develop a protocol that is common across India. So each state develops it, and let's say it's a 9-digit number. The first 2 states indicate a state, second 2 digits indicate a district, and so on, right up to classifying the land as per the state record on whether it's agriculture, non-agriculture. So it is an initiative that has to come from the state, but like in many other areas in the second, that is list 2 in the 7th schedule, the union can incentivize by funding a good substantial part of the cost of the program.
Thank you. Anuj, would you like to?
I'll take the next question on RERA. So the question is, RERA was supposed to transform real estate governance, yet there's been little progress in this area. So I'm actually a very big supporter of RERA myself. I'm having analyzed the law well. See, the challenge is not RERA. RERA is a good legislation for, and it's done well. The problem is when RERA is applied retrospectively to real estate projects which were announced or partially executed well before the RERA came into picture. That's where the problem lies, because projects were sold in a certain manner, the market practices were very different, and suddenly you have this law which says that this is what you can do, you can't do, and it changes the entire dynamics or the viability of the project if you were to apply the RERA today on projects which were announced before RERA's implementation. So that is where the challenge lies, and that is where we see that RERA is not operating well. But if a developer announced a project or launched a project after RERA came into place and implemented the project under RERA, I think it's a very good piece of legislation. The developer is very disciplined, and a lot of the challenges which we saw in real estate projects which went into insolvency, I'm quite confident will not be repeated if you follow the RERA strictly in letter and spirit. And that is where the problem is. The problem is on existing projects, because RERA requires escrow accounts to be created, money to be parked, certain end use of money defined. Now, if the developer was doing it in a different way and you suddenly apply RERA and say you were wrong, and you start prosecuting him for something which he was not supposed to do in the first place, at least not legally supposed to follow in the first place. And that's where the problem lies. And I know of examples, cases, far and few now, but where RERA has actually gone ahead, taken over the project which is stalled, and with the help of the customers, the developer and RERA together have restarted the project. So it's working well. Possibly what could have helped was if we had a more detailed chapter on transition, and we would have dealt with projects already in existence when RERA was implemented in a slightly more practical manner, keeping the challenges in view. And then for new projects, I think RERA is a very good piece of legislation. And it's according to me, it should function well for projects launched after RERA has been announced. I hope that answers.
Thank you, Anuj. We've run out of time, and I would request ISPP and suggest that they bring us all back for a perhaps another session. This is a topic that can hardly be touched upon within an hour, but I think based on given the time constraints, I want to thank all three panelists. I think they've covered an incredible amount of ground here and given us a lot of insights. And I would encourage ISPP scholars, if you have additional questions, please send them to Nidhi or me, and we'll be happy to share it with the panelists. Ambrish, thank you so much for attending the session. Anuj, we are grateful to you for your insights, and Dr. Krishnan, it was a pleasure to and a learning experience for me to hear your views and to read some of your writings that you have shared with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation. Thank you again, and I hope to be in touch with all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ISPP and Dr. Mehta for sharing this wonderful session.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta. Thank you all our panelists for not just highlighting the issues underlying land reforms in India, but also bring to fore the need to bring about these reforms while ensuring inclusive development. Thank you, audience, for all your time. And we would love to have all of you back, our panelists, for another session on land reforms. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.